I would like to invite you to take your Bibles and turn along with me to the Gospel of Luke and chapter 21. Luke chapter 21, we'll start reading there together in just a few moments. I do want to just say a word as we begin tonight that I appreciate the invitation to come back and have the opportunity to speak with you again. Whenever God's people get together, it's a great grace. Whenever we have the opportunity to open up His Word and study it together, it is a great privilege. And so I'm glad to have that opportunity and share with you tonight. Before we get into our text, I wanted to do, at least from my perspective, we'll say sort of my childhood up until now perspective, some major events in American history, as long as I've been alive. So when I was very young, I remember the dissolution of the USSR. And you had the Berlin Wall falling and the Iron Curtain coming down. And I didn't really understand what that meant. But my father was going over to some of those countries because now he had the opportunity to preach, so I learned a little bit about that. But the way that I processed was, okay, the villains have been defeated, and that's it. Nothing else is going to happen, ever. But then I was told about the Gulf. And so now we're going to have us a little war over here, and here's this fella named Saddam Hussein, and as I understood it, we beat everybody up over there, and we went home, and okay, all right, we took care of those guys, and now nothing else is going to happen. Well, of course, that's not how it works out. President Clinton's in office. He has to send troops to various parts of the world. I remember being in high school and my mother coming into the room and saying, someone has flown a plane into a World Trade Center. And as awful as that was at the time, I said, what is a World Trade Center? Because, that's on the other side of the country. And I'm in North Alabama, and that's in New York City, and that just doesn't have anything to do with my world. But as you continue to grow up, and you gain more years, and you continue to age, you realize that those events are always happening. And so what I thought was this sort of definitive battle, Rocky IV probably had something to do with that, but what I thought was this definitive battle between good and evil, that it was all over. Well, no, those things just continue to happen. And so every few years you have a new conflict. I think maybe the thing that has changed for us, though, is that as our technology and our forms of media and our entertainment continue to develop, we are certainly inundated and flooded with more and more information about each of those events. And so maybe that's part of the reason why, even though intellectually we understand that there are always going to be these kinds of world-shaking events, that people tend to treat each one as it comes up as though it's not just world-shaking, it is the end of the world. How are things going to go on? There is no future beyond this if something doesn't change. Well, one of the things that the prophet Isaiah said to the king that he spoke to in chapter 8 is that you are not to fear the things that they fear. And although he's using it in a slightly different way than we use it today, he even says to the people there, when they say, it's a conspiracy, you are not to say it's a conspiracy. This is something that Peter quotes in 1 Peter in chapter 3 as he is speaking to people and trying to help Christians understand how their behavior during difficult times is supposed to stand out from that of the world. And so the lesson is tentatively titled How to Keep from Being Overwhelmed, but it could just as easily be thought of as how Christians behave in times of crisis, or at least what we ought to be aiming for. In Luke chapter 21, the context is we're in that final week of Jesus' ministry. Just a couple of days away from the feast of Passover, and the Lord has been having some very pointed conversations with the crowds, with some of his detractors. And the first few verses of the chapter have the exchange about the widow who gave more than all of the rich. And as they are walking out of the temple, the disciples make an observation that gives Jesus an opportunity to teach them this very lesson. He's going to warn them about some terrible events that they're going to live through, that others are going to see. And he gives instructions on how they, as citizens of the kingdom, ought to conduct themselves and how they, unlike others, can keep from losing their minds. And so in chapter 21 and verse 5, and while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, "As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down." Let's pause there for just a moment, because Jesus, to begin with, has to correct a problem with the disciples' focus. And as they often do, and as we often do, there's a larger point that Jesus is trying to make, and it goes unnoticed because their attention is being held captive by something else. And I think in the disciples' offense or defense, if we could have looked at the temple and all of its glory and all of those magnificent stones, we would have probably been pretty impressed as well. But I think that there is something about this exchange between Jesus and these followers that is somewhat typical of our culture and most cultures. And it's something that makes it harder to put into practice the things that Jesus is going to advise in this chapter. And that is, what are the things that most easily gain our attention? What is it that causes us to be impressed and to just be fixated, and this gains all of our notice? When we think about the areas or the people or the institutions in which people place their faith and their confidence, and they say, this is something that is real. This is something that is lasting. Well, unfortunately, even for Jesus' own disciples, too often, the things that they were focusing on didn't really have any substance. There wasn't anything that was there of any real value or solidity. And that's still the way that it is today. And I think that's at least part of the explanation of why people are so easily unmoored in times of difficulty and crisis, is because a crisis is big, it's flashy, and it gains our attention without really understanding that maybe there's not much there to begin with. So, Jesus continues in the text, and he gives them a similar warning about what it is that they let capture their minds. He says in verse 7, they question him saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "See to it that you are not misled, for many will come in my name saying, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first. But the end does not follow immediately." Pause there again for a moment. So you can imagine the disciples. Jesus has just dropped this bombshell of a prediction that the temple's going to be destroyed, that nothing's going to be left. And so it's only natural that they want to know, when is this going to happen? Well, Jesus is going to give them an answer in just a moment. But before he gets there, he says, I want to warn you about people who will try to take advantage of you during times of distress and emergency. See, there are always people who view the sensational and who view those things who are exciting as a time to be taken advantage of. Now, very often, those are people whose message is empty, whose goals are meaningless, and so they are glad to have something that can either excite or scare or whip up their audience. And so times of crisis are the perfect opportunity for them to get a foot in the door. Now, we might suppose that all of the things that we have, our level of faith, our level of knowledge, whatever it is, that we would not be distracted by those sorts of people. And that we're grounded enough that we're just going to block out all of that noise. It's just chatter that we're not being drawn away by. But I think that there's a very real danger of people being led away by those things that are sensational. Consider the specific warning for the disciples. Can you imagine that any of these men, those who had spent time with Jesus in person for 3.5 years, that they would be fooled by someone showing up pretending to be Jesus? Now, I don't know, maybe Jesus didn't mean that quite as literally as he said it, but it sure sounds like he does. It sounds like he's talking to men who have been with him for 3.5 years and warning them, saying, some people are going to show up and they're going to pretend to be me. Don't be fooled. I feel like he's telling them that because there was the danger of them being fooled. I think that's a warning for me to take to heart, that I should never consider myself to just be too grounded, too mature, and too above it all, that I'm not going to get swept away in the middle of a crisis. Surely no one would come in and take advantage of me. Well, what if it is accompanied by some sort of great catastrophe? There's a war. There's a rumor of a war. There's a natural disaster. Has anybody had a conversation with a friend or a neighbor in the last couple of years that says, do you suppose that this event over in Iran or this thing over here in Syria, fill in the blank with whatever the crisis is that week, but do you think this might be what Revelation is talking about? No one? All right, there's a couple of us. We hang out with weird people, but they're out there. I guess this is what Jeremiah was talking about. I suppose this is when it's going to happen. Well, what if those things are taking place? Wars and catastrophes. Oh, Jesus says that doesn't mean anything. And when he says that, he's not trying to pretend as though they don't have real consequences in the lives of the people who experience them. What he is saying is that they don't mean anything in terms of the overall passing of time, that yes, these things are happening, but they've always happened. And they're always going to happen until the end comes. Well, I think that passage, again, is pertinent for conversations that if you haven't had them yet, you can and will have them today during times of distress. And what you'll find is that people who will not give you 1 minute to talk about baptism or to talk about grace, or to talk about any of those things, if you say, I've got some pretty cool secrets from Revelation, it's like, oh, wow. All right, let's sit down, sign me up. And if you've got a high-res, glossy invitation, all the better. Again, it's a real threat today, just like it was for disciples in the first century. It's a message for then, it's a message for now that we need to take to heart to ensure that my faith is grounded enough in truth, that it's planted firmly enough in reality that I'm not easily agitated by events that have no greater meaning and by people who try to take advantage of those times with messages that are without substance. Well, let's return to our text. In verse 10, then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famine, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead you to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. Now again, as we stated a moment ago, the things that Jesus is saying here are in answer to a specific question. And so this has an immediate context. Jesus has said this temple's going to get knocked down. The disciples ask, when is it going to happen? How do we know it's coming? But the theme of what Jesus is saying, his core message, is still applicable for us and disciples in any age. Again, how do God's people act? How do they react to their circumstances when the world seems to be falling apart? And to take that one step further, how do God's people react when not only is the world falling apart, but it seems like it's being directed personally at them? Or if not personally at them, that they are at least being affected in a very direct way. Well, I want you to think about the things that you've seen with your friends and neighbors, just the things that maybe you've seen on the news or social media. How do people usually react when things are bad? When there's a crisis going on, when there's any sort of trial that's being faced, how do they react? Especially if they're suffering. Well, first, what we usually do is we've got to complain. And that complaint starts with that my situation is so unfair. This shouldn't happen to me. Now maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. Maybe I got myself in that mess. But I'm going to complain because I'm suffering and people need to know about it. The second thing, or another thing that we'll do, is people will panic. And so the questions that are asked is, what's going to happen? What are we supposed to do? How are we going to make it through this? What about the things that I have planned in the future? All of those things are going to fall through. Another thing that might happen when there's a crisis or an emergency is maybe I've got to try and pick a side in this issue. And then, when the conflict comes about, I'm going to loudly declare my opinions on all platforms that I can. And unfortunately, sometimes people use that as an excuse to behave badly. And maybe that's, on one extreme. If there's let's say a natural disaster, you might see people who are looting or rioting. Or over on the other extreme, you just have people who speak and act toward others in ways that no sane, rational person should speak or act. You can consider for yourself, but I think that's a reasonably fair summation of the normal kinds of reactions that you see in our culture wherever you look when something bad is happening. Maybe we can sort of look back through for just a moment at what Jesus has said that citizens of the kingdom in the not too distant future we're going to have to endure. In verse 11, he just says, generally, things are going to be chaotic. That's the baseline. Things are going to be in turmoil. Then, in verse 12, it's going to be directed at you. You're going to be persecuted. You're going to be taken by force, and you're going to be persecuted. If that's not bad enough, verse 16, it's not just going to be the government or some faceless authority figure. It's going to be your friends. It could be your family. And there's not really anywhere to turn to that's some sort of safe harbor. For some of them, verse 17, you're going to be hated by everyone. Ultimately, verse 16, there are even going to be those who will lose their earthly life. Now, verse 18 and 19 seem to indicate that whatever happens to them physically, they will be preserved spiritually. They will gain their eternal life. But at least on this earth, verse 16, not everyone is going to make it through these events. That's about as bad as it can get. And so how are they to live through it? How are they supposed to conduct themselves? Well, he says you're supposed to be a faithful and a confident disciple of Christ, as opposed to losing your composure, as opposed to abandoning the faith and principles that you've stood by up to this point. You're going to stand in readiness. He says you're going to look for opportunities to turn this persecution into a time to speak about your faith in me. It will be an opportunity, verse 13, for your testimony. Instead of just throwing up their hands and saying, oh, this is too much, I'm getting too tired. Instead of being faint-hearted, he says you're going to persevere. He said this was when you would contrast the stability that comes from being a believer in God to that sort of panic that accompanies those who place their faith in people and systems and institutions of this world. He says instead of being distracted or discouraged by the things that are happening around you today or tomorrow, he says citizens of his kingdom can take heart because they know that God is sovereign. And again, verses 16 through 19, even if they lost their life here, their souls would still be preserved in his hands. Well, if we return to our text for a moment, in verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave. And those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now Jesus gives them another warning about what they need to do to evacuate when Jerusalem finally does come under siege. But there's something that he says here that underscores the point that he just made in verse 16. Even during times, let me say it this way. During times of earthly judgment, even if some sort of natural disaster, some sort of worldly power rising up over another one, even if that is God's providence acting, it doesn't mean that all of God's people will make it through that physically unscathed. When nations are being brought down or when nations are being raised up, we may be affected. We're not immune. We're not placed in a bubble and set to the side while all the bad things happen and then we get put back on the playing field when everything has cleared. What is important, verse 19 again, is that our soul is in his hands. The disciples, I think probably in a unique way, were promised the assistance of the Spirit to know what they ought to say, to know how to conduct themselves. But even if that is a specific sort of context for them, because we have the revealed Word of God, the Spirit still enables us to stand strong and to be able to speak as the Spirit has spoken through the Word, to be able to be instructed to answer for the kind of hope that we have within us. Again, that passage from 1 Peter being given in this same kind of context, that when the world is falling apart and when you are being persecuted, but you are not losing your mind, and someone says, why is it that you can live the kind of life that you're living in this world? You say, let me tell you about Jesus. And let me tell you about what he did that gives me hope. And let me tell you about where my faith is, because that's how I can be who I am. And that's why my life looks the way that it looks. The disciples in the first century were being prepared that when the world was in turmoil, that if they acted like citizens of the kingdom and not let themselves be swept away in worldly agendas or overcome by worldly chatter, that they would be able to speak out on behalf of Jesus as the Christ and as the real king and director of world events. Now, as the text goes on, we are only going to be going as far as verse 24. But as the text goes on, Jesus continues to instruct them on signs and times of when these things will take place. But I want us to try to draw a few points as we start to get toward the end of our time together tonight. Christians need to understand the importance of making absolutely sure that what they are building their faith on is real and has substance. If I can sort of borrow the language from a different context, John speaks about testing the spirits, proving them. Think about what you're putting your faith in. Think about the kinds of teaching that you're putting your faith in, or that you're allowing to instruct and build your faith. The people that you're looking to as examples, the ideas that you're letting shape your thought. Test them. Don't just jump on them and assume that there's something of substance there. Weigh it against the oracles of God and make sure that what you are hearing is what is being spoken as God has revealed. Again, our faith should not be pulled away by the sensational. We're always impressed by things that are bigger, by things that are flashier, by things that are extreme. I went into a Texaco today. This is somewhat neither here nor there. But there was a can of coffee. It had a skull on it. It said, Ultra Death Triple Shot Espresso. And I broke out in the cold sweats just looking at it. But the whole marketing of this thing is, you don't just want a cup of coffee. You want a near-death experience. You've got to make it big. You've got to make it ultimate. And I always think about what Paul wrote to the Thessalonians in chapter 4 and verse 11 of his first epistle. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we commanded you, so that you will walk properly toward outsiders and not be in any need. Sometimes the most sensational and extreme thing that someone can do is just be normal and just be calm and collected and mind your business and keep your head down and do your work. And if you think that that kind of a thing doesn't make difference or doesn't make a difference, just think back to the opportunities that you had on occasions like September 11th, when people had no idea what was going on. And so many people had tragedy that was experienced not just on a national level, but up close and personal. But then they could look and they would see somebody who wasn't falling apart, who was just doing what they were supposed to do and ready to work, ready to help if the opportunity arose. If you can continue to mind your business, work with your hands, live with a quiet life, and do what you're supposed to do, that will make an enormous impact in a world that has trouble coping just getting through each and every day. And what that faith does is prepare us for a time when a final judgment does arrive. Because while we live each day with an understanding that we're not going to act as though all of these crises and events mean that the world is coming to an end, we do know that one day it will come to an end. And that one day there will be a final judgment and a final crisis for those who are unprepared to face it. We try to focus on this chapter tonight from the perspective of how does a citizen of God's kingdom behave during a time of crisis. Having a faith that is built on real substance and a reliance on the Lord enables us to endure times that are hard. And it enables us to be ready to take advantage of opportunities for the Lord. And if we live that way during times of earthly crisis and earthly judgment, we'll be ready to face Him, calm, collected, for that final judgment. In just a moment, we're going to have the opportunity to sing together as our brother leads us in a song that's designed to encourage us to further thought tonight. For those who haven't yet obeyed the gospel, to take advantage of that opportunity to respond to the sin in your life, declare your belief in the Lord, to be ready to repent and confess and to follow Him in obedience into the waters of baptism. And for those who have made that choice already, and you just desire encouragement and help from your brethren, I know they'd be glad to offer it. You'll have those opportunities in just a moment as we get ready to stand and sing.